minute I was carrying a basket of laundry down the basement stairs, and the next I was at the bottom, my right ankle twisted underneath me at an angle I knew immediately was wrong, my shoulder blade screaming where it had caught the corner of the step. I lay there on the cold concrete for what felt like an hour. It was probably 4 minutes. I know because when I finally got my phone out of my housecoat pocket and looked at it, it said 7:18 a.m. And by the time my neighbor Ruthann, no wait, let me start over with her name. By the time Bea from next door heard me through the basement window and called 911, it was 7:22. I had been down there in the dark, on the concrete, unable to stand, unable to crawl back up because of my shoulder, just lying there with the laundry basket tipped over beside me and my husband's old flannel shirts scattered around me on the floor. He's been gone 11 years. I still wash his shirts twice a year. I don't know why, I just do. The paramedics were kind, young. One of them reminded me of my son when he was 23, before his jaw got set that way it gets now, that closed-off look. The paramedic held my hand in the ambulance and told me I was doing great. I believed him. I needed to believe someone. My ankle was fractured in 2 places. My shoulder had a partial tear that the orthopedic surgeon said was likely an old injury, aggravated by the fall. And she was right. I'd heard it years ago carrying boxes when we moved my daughter-in-law's things into the house after the wedding. Not that anyone remembered that. My blood pressure was elevated. They admitted me. The intake nurse asked for my emergency contact. I gave her my son's number. I gave her my daughter-in-law's number. I told her my son worked from home, so he should be reachable. She nodded and wrote it down. What I did not know, lying there in Bay 7 of the emergency department with ice on my ankle and a hospital gown that tied in the back, was that my son and his wife were not home. They were not in the state. They were in Sedona, Arizona, where they had driven the previous morning without telling me, and where they would remain for the next 4 days, and where, when the hospital called my son's cell phone 8 times between 7:45 a.m. and noon, and then 6 more times that afternoon, he would look at the number, recognize it as a medical exchange, and send it to voicemail every single time. I know this because I eventually saw his phone log, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The first day, I assumed he was in a meeting. He runs a small accounting firm out of the back bedroom of their house, and sometimes he has client calls that run long. I told myself that. I told myself he would call back. I asked the nurse if anyone had reached him, and she gave me a small smile, the kind they give you when the answer is no. But they don't want to say it plainly, and she said they were still trying. That night I slept badly. The person in the next bed kept the television on. I stared at the ceiling and thought about how I used to drive 45 minutes each way to watch my grandson's soccer games on Saturday mornings in the rain. I thought about the Thanksgiving 2 years ago when my daughter-in-law said she was thinking of starting her own business and I offered to invest. I had some savings, I told her. I wanted to help. And she smiled and took my hand and said, "You are the most generous woman." That's what she said. The most generous woman. On the second day, the attending physician came in and explained that with my age and blood pressure, they wanted to keep me another night and run a few more tests. He asked again about my emergency contact. I saw him glance at my chart. I saw something flicker across his face that might have been pity and that he quickly replaced with professionalism. "Is there anyone else we can call?" he asked. "A neighbor? A friend?" I thought about that for a moment. I have a friend from church, Wallace, who moved to her daughter's house in Tennessee 2 years ago. I have a woman I used to do water aerobics with at the Y, but we drifted. I have my neighbor Bea, who is 81 and doesn't drive. "Try my son again," I said. "Please." They tried 4 more times that day. He didn't answer. On the 3rd morning, I woke up early, before the breakfast trays came around, and I lay there thinking. Not dramatically, not with the kind of cinematic grief you see in movies, just quietly, the way you think when something that you've been half knowing for a long time suddenly becomes impossible to unknow. I thought about my son's face the last time I'd visited their house, how he'd looked at his wife when I said I might want to downsize eventually, maybe look at a senior community, She'd raised her eyebrows slightly and he'd made that jaw-closing motion and said, "Let's talk about that later, Mom." We never talked about it later. That was 8 months ago. I thought about my birthday in March. They'd sent a gift card. Not a card with a gift card in it. Just a gift card. In an envelope with their address printed on a label, the way you'd mail a bill. I thought about the week after my husband died, 11 years ago, and how my son had sat with me on the porch every evening for a month. Just sat there, not saying much. And how I thought then, this one I raised right. I had to stop thinking about that because the breakfast tray came. On the afternoon of the third day, a physical therapist came to assess me for discharge, and while she was showing me how to use the crutches, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was my daughter-in-law. "Mom," she said, and her voice had that particular brightness it gets when she wants something or when she's managing me. "How are you feeling? We just heard." I asked her what she meant by just heard. She said that her mother had seen something on the local community Facebook group. A neighbor had apparently posted asking if anyone knew how to reach my son's family because his mother had been taken to the hospital. The hospital had been calling for 3 days. A Facebook post from a neighbor got through in 4 hours. I asked her where they were. She said they'd taken a little trip. Just a few days. They'd been so stressed lately with work, they really needed it. She was sorry she hadn't mentioned it. Things had been so hectic. Her voice stayed bright the whole time. I asked her if she'd seen the calls from the hospital. There was a pause, just a small one. Then she said that her phone had been on Do Not Disturb for most of the trip. They were really trying to disconnect and recharge. She was sure my son hadn't realized the calls were from a hospital specifically. I said, "It's a medical exchange. The callback number says Mercy Regional." She said she was sure he hadn't looked closely. I said, "He has a mother who is 68 years old and lives alone. When a medical exchange calls 17 times, you look closely." She said she understood I was upset. I was not upset. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I was not crying. I was not raising my voice. My hands were not shaking. I was perfectly calm. I was calm in the way you get sometimes when something inside you settles into a place it's been moving toward for a very long time, and once it settles it doesn't move again. I told her I needed to rest and I ended the call. They arrived the next morning just before my discharge. My son walked in, looking slightly sunburned and carrying a gas station bouquet of flowers, the kind wrapped in plastic with the rubber band still on. He leaned down to hug me and I could smell sunscreen. He said he was sorry. He'd had no idea this was a wake-up call for all of them. He was going to make some changes. My daughter-in-law stood near the door and gave me a smile that did not quite reach her eyes and said, "We're just so glad you're okay." I thanked them for coming. I let my son carry my bag to his car. I watched my daughter-in-law take a phone call in the parking lot, laughing at something still tan from Sedona. I did not say what I was thinking. I am 68 years old, and I have learned that there are moments when the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing and watch carefully. What I was watching was this. In the car, my son talked about his work, about a client who'd been difficult, about a project that had finally closed. My daughter-in-law mentioned that they were thinking of remodeling the kitchen and asked what I thought about open plan layouts. Neither of them asked about my ankle. Neither of them asked how I had spent 3 days alone in a hospital room. Neither of them asked who had brought me my reading glasses or who had found my slippers after the aide knocked them under the bed. Bea had brought my glasses. One of the nurses had found my slippers. When they dropped me at my house and helped me get settled on the sofa with my ankle elevated, my son said he'd called to check in, and my daughter-in-law hugged me and said to call if I needed anything at all. Then they left. I heard their car back out of the driveway. I sat there for a while. Then I opened my phone and went to Instagram. I don't use Instagram much. I have an account because my church posts photos there, and occasionally my son's family does too. I scrolled back through the past few days. There was a photo of the red rocks at sunset. There was a photo of a restaurant table with 2 glasses of wine and a small card that said "Table for 2." There was a video of my daughter-in-law laughing at something, her hair blowing in the desert wind, my son's hand visible in the corner of the frame. And there, posted at 9:47 a.m., On the first day I was in the hospital, 3 hours after the hospital began calling, was a photo of the two of them sitting on the terrace of what looked like a resort. My son had his arm around her. They were both squinting into the morning sun. The caption said, "Finally breathing. No noise, no obligations. Just the two of us and the desert. This is what we needed." The photo had 63 likes. I scrolled down to the comments. There were things like, "You both deserve this," and "Beautiful," and "Life is short, live it." I read them all. Then I put my phone down and looked at the window. No obligations. I thought about what that meant. I thought about who constitutes an obligation in my son's life. His clients, surely. His mortgage. The car payment. The remodel they were planning. His wife's comfort. Her happiness. Her rest. His mother, recovering from surgery alone in a hospital room 30 miles away. Apparently, not that. I want to say something here, and I need to say it plainly, because I've spent a long time being careful with words, and I think sometimes that carefulness is its own kind of dishonesty. I was not looking for my son to be perfect. I was not looking for him to be attentive every day, to call every week, to remember every appointment. I know how life works. I know that children grow up and build their own lives and their own obligations, and that is right, and that is how it should be. I did not raise my son to orbit around me. But there is a floor. There is a minimum, and that minimum is this. When a hospital calls you 17 times in 3 days because your mother is injured and alone, you answer the phone. That's the floor. It is not a high floor. It is about as low as a floor can get and still be called a floor. He had gone through it. I didn't make any decisions that day. I've learned not to do that, not to make permanent decisions on temporary pain, not to send the email or make the call when you're still close to the feeling. I iced my ankle. I watched a nature documentary about migratory birds. I ate crackers and soup from a can because I couldn't stand long enough to cook. I went to bed. But I started noticing things I'd explained away before. The way my son would look at his phone when I was talking. Not rudely, not obviously, just elsewhere. The way my daughter-in-law would say, "We'll have to have you over soon," at the end of every visit, and the soon that was never given a date. The Christmas when they drove 5 hours to her parents' house 3 days early but came to mine for 4 hours on December 26th because traffic would be impossible on the 25th. The time I mentioned I was having chest flutters and my daughter-in-law said, "That's probably stress, you should do some yoga," and moved on. I'd explained all of it. I'd told myself I was being sensitive, or that they were busy, or that this is just how the younger generation is. They're overwhelmed, they're managing a lot. I had been very understanding. I had been so very understanding for so very long. 3 weeks after I came home from the hospital, I made an appointment with my attorney. Her name is Wallace. No, that's my friend. I'm being careful with names here. My attorney's name is Charlene, and I have used her for everything for 15 years. My husband's estate, a property dispute with a previous neighbor, and now this. I told her I wanted to update my documents. The house, which I own free and clear, had been left to my son in my existing will. I had assumed, vaguely, in the way you assume things you don't want to look at directly, that this would work itself out. That he would be present, that there would be a relationship, that the house would be the last in a long series of things I would give him, rather than the only one that had any legal weight. I changed the primary beneficiary to a land trust that will sell the property and split the proceeds between 2 charities I've supported for years, a food bank 2 towns over and a literacy program at the county library. I updated my healthcare proxy to Bea. She's 81 and sharp as a tack, and she was there when I needed someone, which puts her ahead of my son on every relevant metric. I also closed the savings account I'd been quietly accumulating for years, the one that my son knew about and had mentioned more than once, in the tone of someone who was beginning to think about what comes next. I moved the money to a different bank under a different account structure. I didn't hide it. It's in my name, but it is no longer the thing he thinks it is. I did not tell my son any of this. The reason I did not tell him is not because I wanted to punish him. I want to say that clearly. This was not a punishment. Punishments are things you do to change someone's behavior, and I was no longer trying to change my son's behavior. I had stopped believing that was possible or that it was my job. This was something else. This was me acknowledging, finally, what already existed. A relationship in which I was an obligation to be managed rather than a parent to be known, and arranging my affairs accordingly. 6 weeks after my attorney visit, on a Thursday afternoon, my son called. He didn't call to check in. He called because he had spoken to a cousin of mine, a woman who knows everyone's business and always has. And the cousin had mentioned something she'd heard. I genuinely don't know how. The family network in our town has always been mysterious to me. About changes to my estate documents. My son's voice, when I answered, had a quality I'd heard in it before, but usually in the context of business matters. Focused. Alert. Stripped of warmth by urgency. He said he'd heard I'd been to see an attorney. I said I had. He said he hoped everything was okay. Was something wrong? Was I all right? I told him I was fine. He said someone had mentioned something about the house, and he just wanted to make sure I hadn't made any major decisions, without thinking it through properly, because he worried about me sometimes. He worried that I was isolated, and that isolation could make a person think in ways that weren't. And here he paused, choosing his word. Balanced. I let him finish. Then I said, when the hospital called you 23 times in 3 days, did you look at the number? Silence. Because I've been trying to understand it, I said. I've been thinking about it for weeks now, and I'd like to understand. Did you see the calls and decide not to answer? Or did you genuinely not look at your phone? He said. And I remember this exactly because I have thought about it many times since. He said that it had been a difficult year, that he and his wife had really needed that trip, that they'd made a decision to truly disconnect and he hadn't checked his phone regularly, and that he was sorry. He was sorry he hadn't been there. He should have been, and he knew that, and he would do better. You've said that before, I told him. You said it in the hospital room. You said you'd make changes. He said he meant it. I said I believe that you believe that. There was a long pause. The house, he started, is mine, I said. What I do with it is mine to decide. He said he wasn't questioning that. He said he'd always assumed. He said that he thought after everything, after all the years, I repeated, not as a question, just as a thing I wanted to hear out loud. He was quiet again. I told him I loved him. I do love him. That's the part of this that doesn't make a good story and doesn't fit neatly into any conclusion. I love my son. I have loved him since I first held him, and that hasn't changed and it won't change, and there's nothing he could do that would change it. Love like that doesn't have an off switch. But love and trust are different things. Love and presence are different things. Love, it turns out, is not the same as a relationship. I told him that I hoped things would be different going forward. I told him my door was open. I told him that if he wanted to know me, not my house, not my savings account, not the person who sends Christmas cards and can be managed with a phone call every few weeks, but actually know me, come to my house for dinner and sit across the table from me and ask me something real, that I would be here. He said he would call next week. He has not called. I've been thinking about something my husband used to say in the last years of his life when he'd gotten philosophical about things. He used to say that the hardest thing about getting older isn't the body. The body you can manage. The hardest thing is learning which losses are real and which are just the loss of something you imagined. The son I imagined would have answered the phone. The son I have is a stranger who shares my last name and my nose and very little else. I grieve the stranger. I do. I sit with that grief on certain evenings, usually when the light goes soft and I'm in the garden, which I still keep, which my ankle has healed enough to let me keep, and I think about the boy who used to fall asleep on the sofa with his head on my lap watching Saturday night television, and I let myself feel the distance between that boy and this man. And the grief is real, and I don't try to talk myself out of it. But I also stand up. That's the part I want you to hear if any of this is familiar to you. I stand up and I brush the dirt off my gloves, and I go inside and I make myself dinner, and I call Bea, and I live my life. Last month, I joined a watercolor class on Tuesday evenings at the community center. I am not talented. My instructor, a patient woman named Derry, told me last week that my horizon lines were bold, which I believe was diplomacy, but I am learning to love the boldness. I am 68 years old and I am learning a new thing, and my horizon lines are bold. I have changed my emergency contact at every doctor's office, every hospital, everywhere that had my son's name on file. Bea's number is in all of them now. She knows where I keep my important documents, where I keep my medications, what I am allergic to, and the name of my attorney. My son does not know that. My son knows the things I used to tell him when I still believed he was paying attention. I don't know how this ends. That's the honest answer. I don't know if my son will become someone who shows up, who chooses presence over convenience, who one day drives to my house without being asked and sits across from me and asks something real. People change. I've seen it. It's not impossible. What I know is this: I am not waiting. I am not arranging my life around the hope of something that has not happened. I am not shrinking myself into the corner of a room, taking up less space, making less noise, being less inconvenient, in the hope that someone will finally decide I'm worth the trouble. I fell down a flight of stairs. I lay on a cold basement floor for 4 minutes. I spent 3 days in a hospital where the only people who showed up were strangers, who were paid to be there, and a neighbor who drove herself to do it. I came home and I read the words "no obligations" on a picture taken while I was in surgery. And then I stood up. That's it. That's the whole story. Some stories end with a reconciliation, with a changed heart, with a phone call in which everything said is the right thing. This one doesn't. This one ends with me in my garden, in the evening, with dirt on my gloves, in a life that is mine and that no one can take from me. That is enough. I have decided it is enough. And deciding is the whole thing, really. Deciding that what you have is worth protecting, that you are worth protecting, that a life lived with dignity in a small house with bold horizon lines is not a consolation prize. It is the prize.